across 23 regions in the globe, and India is one of those regions. But that does not mean that you can only operate out of India. When you log into the AWS console, you have the option of choosing any region that you want and run your infrastructure out of those regions. Beyond the regions, we also have this concept called availability zones. So what we mean by availability zone is within each region, we run multiple data centers. So if you look at the Mumbai region itself, from which most of the customers in India avail services, we run across 3 availability zones. So what this means is there is a cluster of data centers in each availability zone, and these zones are actually separated by um, uh, by a certain distance. What it means is even if one availability zone goes down due to, say, a flood or an earthquake or something like that, the other availability zones are still available, and you can architect your solutions in such a way that they are available for customers all the time, even if one of the AZs goes wrong. So we call availability zones AZs, and that's a common terminology that you may see as you look at the AWS documentation. Beyond availability zones, the other thing you need to understand is what we call points of presence. So there are close to 220 plus points of presence in the globe, and we have close to 11 in India itself. So what we mean by a point of presence is many customers, they have solutions that that need really low latency. So this could be one of the examples could be someone like Hotstar or Netflix, where the video that you watch need to be really fast, and hence the content that you serve needs to be cached very close to the customer. So what happens is, if you serve everything from one region, say Mumbai, and someone from Kolkata is trying to reach that content, it still needs to overcome the network latency that one experiences. So what we provide is something called a point of presence, on which content can be cached at the edge. So let's say you are a customer out of Chennai, you could, and you can potentially serve content and cache it in some point of presence that is closer to Chennai, and it need not come from Mumbai. So we have a service called Amazon CloudFront that allows you to take advantage of the points of presence that are there across India. Beyond that, all our points of presence and regions are redundant. They're connected through a redundant 100 gigabit network that circles across the globe. It operates without impact through a link cut. What that means is these are redundant links, and even if one of them gets cut, the other one will be there to serve the network. This private capacity is between all the regions except for China. Next, I will go through the breadth and depth of services that we offer. As I said, AWS has close to 180 services that cuts across multiple categories. Primarily, when we started AWS, it started with just providing compute, which means you could run servers on AWS. Compute and storage was some of the earlier services that we had. But over a period of time, we have added more and more to the portfolio. So today, if you look at the AWS console, you will see services that cut across analytics, DevOps, Internet of Things, IoT, machine learning, mobile, blockchain, migration services, infrastructure, and so on and so forth. What we will do in the next few slides is take a look at some of the core services that most customers use, and you may also want to start with as you build your business on AWS. So compute is one of the key services that all customers start with. This is where you implement your business logic, right? Most of us are trying to build applications of some sort, and that needs to be opened up to end customers. So you need to use computing logic to run your business logic. So if you look at AWS, there are three ways in which compute can be consumed. The first is called Amazon EC2. EC2 stands for Elastic Compute. The second is to run containers on AWS. So there are services called Amazon ECS, EKS, and Fargate that allow you to run containers. I will dive deep into containers as we get to the slide. The third is something we call AWS Lambda, which is a completely serverless platform. Lambda is essentially it helps you run a function as a service. So if you look at the spectrum of these three as a spectrum, EC2 essentially lets you spin up a server and run it 24/7, and you have to manage the server most of the time, the operating system and upwards. In the case of ECS, EKS, and Fargate, which helps you run containers, you just need to provide us what is called a Docker container, which hosts your application, and everything from the operating system below is something that's completely taken care by AWS. In the case of Lambda, all you need to do is write a function in a language that is supported. So the major languages that we support are JavaScript that runs on Node.js, Python, Ruby, Java, C, and even some custom runtimes. So all you need in this case is to write a function, and you can use Lambda to host that service completely. So these are the three major categories of services that customers use to implement business logic. So if we just get into Amazon EC2 itself, these are essentially virtual server instances that run on the cloud. So you can think of this as, let's say you're running your own computer at home. Now let's say you want to run a computer or a hardware server on AWS, but want to access it over the net. What you would do is to spin up an EC2 server. There are multiple categories of EC2 servers that one can use, starting from general purpose server to burstable and so on and so forth. So customers, as they run their infrastructure or their applications on AWS, they have different types of use cases. Some of these use cases would be heavily compute intensive. What I mean by that is it'll need a lot of CPUs to execute that logic. Some may be memory intensive, some could be storage intensive, and so on and so forth. Customers who build games typically need to use graphics or GPU based or graphics intensive chips. Customers who want to run, say, machine learning models and build ML models on us typically tend to use GPU based compute. So there are multiple categories of compute servers that we provide. And within that, you even have choice in terms of what processors that you want to run. Processor choices are typically Intel, AMD, and ARM-based processors that AWS ourselves have built. Similarly, you have capabilities around how fast they need to be, what the memory footprint should be, what sort of networking it should provide, and so on and so forth. So if you look at the combination of categories and capabilities, at AWS we provide close to more than 275 types of instances. Most customers who want to build simple web-based applications start with general purpose EC2 instances. On top of this, you have also the ability to run multiple operating systems. So when you spin up a server, You also have to configure the server to have a host operating system. So we have a set of operating systems that we support that you can see in the slide. Most of these are Unix or Linux based systems, but we also support Windows based systems. You can further look at the documentation on aws.amazon.com to see all kinds of operating systems that we support. Now within an EC2, one of the things that you will notice is that you have several types of purchase options that you can take advantage of. Most customers, when they spin up a server on AWS, they do this in on-demand mode. So what it means is, when you start a server on demand, it can actually scale up and down based on the workload that you're running. But there are a lot of customers who also know that they are going to run a website or some workload that has to be continuously running for an extended period of time. It could be say 1 year to 3 years and so on. So for these customers, we provide certain categories of purchasing options that are called reserved instances or savings plans. What I mean by these are essentially, volume discounted plans that customers can purchase based on the need that you have to run a particular service. You can commit to a certain usage for a 1 to 3 year period, and you can get a lower rate or a lower price for the EC2, same on-demand EC2 server that you get. You can get up to 30 to 50% discount as you pick and choose, reserved instances and savings plans. You also have a purchasing option called Spot that is usually targeted at customers who run fault tolerant workloads. So what I mean by this is there are certain uh, applications or workloads that customers run that even if they stop midway, they can continue from that point onwards at a later point in time, even if, let's say, the processor is, let's say, taken away or the compute is taken away. So what we do is as we build capacity within AWS, which is a lot of the capacity that we forecast and build lies unused. So what we do is we take this unused capacity and provide this at a 90%, up to a 90% discount on-demand prices. So this is a category of purchasing option called Spot. And customers have the option of picking a Spot instance and running some workloads on these instances. What happens is, if, let's say, we see a lot of on-demand requirement that comes up, we may actually take away the Spot capacity from you with a 2-minute notification. So what you can do is, if, let's say, your workload is fault tolerant, within that 2 minutes, you can save the state of the workload in some kind of a storage, and you can spin up an instance again after 2 minutes with a different different type of Spot instance. So if you have such a workload, you can actually reduce 90% of cost on demand. So these are some of the purchase options that we provide, and different customers use either of these or a combination of these, depending on the type of workload that they run. Moving on to the second category of compute that I spoke about. In the last 7 to 10 years, there's been widespread adoption of what we call the container construct, right? A container is basically a lightweight standalone executable package of software that usually includes all dependencies. It includes code, runtime, even the operating system, the system libraries, the environment, and so on and so forth. So what Docker as a platform does is it enables you to take an application and package it as a container. Once you package your application as a container, you have the ability to take that in and run it in uh, an environment that is provided by Docker. It's a kernel that Docker provides, and you can run multiple types of applications within containers. So as you can see in this example, you can run a Tomcat stack inside a container. You can have an Apache Tomcat web server with a JVM running underneath with on Debian. That's one stack that you can run. For the database, you could potentially run a SQL Server on .NET on an Ubuntu platform. This is another stack that you package on a container. Third is you can even have static binaries that are serving files on Alpine. So these are different ways in which containers can be packaged. And as part of AWS, we provide a set of services that enable you to very easily run containers. So if you package your application as a Docker container, we have services that help you quickly run or very easily run on AWS. So one way to do this is to simply spin up an EC2 instance like this, install Docker in each of these EC2 instances, and then run your Docker applications as tasks within these instances. This is how you would usually do in your local machine, for example. But within AWS, we provide a service called ECS, which contains all of this, all the necessary infrastructure that you have to run a Docker application, like an ECS agent, a Docker agent, and an ECS-based Amazon machine image that enables you to very quickly spin up, Docker applications within ECS. What ECS does is it takes care of actually scheduling and orchestrating all the applications within what we call the ECS service. So you can just go to the ECS service and create a very simple file, which is in the JSON format, what we call a task definition file, which points to a Docker-based application. So you have a Docker. Docker usually is stored. A Docker image is stored in a repository that is either provided by Docker or something that we provide called the Elastic Container Registry. So you can simply create a very simple file and point the ECS service to that, and your applications can quickly spin up on ECS in no time. We also provide. So one of the challenges with this is also when you pick and run a service, you also need to usually have an idea of what sort of instance it needs to run on, what sort of CPU it needs to run on, what sort of memory it needs, and so on and so forth. But a lot of customers, as they spin more and more containers, even managing that becomes a problem. So we provide another service that's built on top of ECS. It's called Fargate, which completely takes away the pain of you having to manage an underlying infrastructure to run containers. This option is called Fargate. And in Fargate, all you have to do is in your task definition file that I spoke about, you just need to mention how much CPU you need and how much memory you need for running the Docker application. And at AWS, we completely take care of the underlying infrastructure to run that application. We also take care of scaling the underlying infrastructure up and down based on the properties that you provide at the task definition file. So what ECS and Fargate essentially does is it actually changes the way you consume compute. Originally, if you were to run this on your own data center, or if you were to run this on an EC2 instance, like if you spin up your own server, typically you would pay for the time for which that particular service is running. So most production servers, you will spin it up and keep them running 24/7. Even if, let's say, the application is accessed maybe only for a few hours in a day, you would still have to keep it running. But in the case of the Fargate based consumption model, you don't have any instances to manage, and the pricing is purely based on usage. So this essentially changes the way in which you consume resources. The third category of compute that I spoke about is Lambda, which is function as a service. Now, um, if you look at Lambda, it is what we call serverless compute, and you basically run a function. It could be a Node.js function or a Ruby or a Python function. But beyond Lambda, there are also a lot of other services that you can use, which fall under our serverless portfolio. So usually it is not just compute that you need to run an application, right? You need to also have something to store your files, for example, if you have images or videos. So for that, we have something called Amazon S3, which is a completely serverless service that allows you to store objects. The other category of service that you may need is a database, right? So within database itself, you will need, say, relational databases that use a SQL construct, or you may need key value stores, which we call NoSQL databases. So we have something called Amazon DynamoDB. Also, we have something called Amazon Aurora Serverless. These enable you to run databases in a completely serverless fashion. Similarly, you will need, a lot of customers need a way to route customers' request to their backend infrastructure. So we have a service called Amazon API Gateway that allows you to do this. If you were to build, applications based on, say, a microservices architecture, you customers typically look to use queues to connect applications together. So we have two types of queues, SQS and SNS, that allow you to do messaging to connect applications together. Similarly, we have within categories like analytics, edge compute, monitoring, orchestration, and so on. There are multiple services that are available that allow you to spin up something in a purely serverless fashion. What I mean by this is, um, if you go to the Amazon console, and for any of these services, to use these services, you don't have to spin up a server. All you need to do is to be able to understand how to use the service using an API, or if you understand, this is an application programming interface, right? So as long as you understand the API to call these services and use these services, you really don't need to worry about how to manage the underlying infrastructure for all of these. So a lot of startups, when they are still ideating and they're beginning their businesses, uh, the management of infrastructure can be an unnecessarily heavy lifting. So a lot of startups opt for API based or serverless services to build their applications on, and as they progress, if they need more control, then they migrate away from these to more lower level services like EC2 and Fargate and so on. So this is some of the give an idea of what sort of applications one can build on Lambda, and some of the other services that we spoke about in the previous slide. We have customers like Zillow, Localytics, that are building analytics services, that they're building businesses in operational management and live dashboarding. There are services like Slack and Zapier and Twilio that are building their bots and webhooks on serverless infrastructure. Similarly, for data workflows, which include content management and ETL workflows, we have customers like Thomson Reuters and FireEye that are building such services. Um, Similarly, some of these names like Netflix, Autodesk, Hotstar, all of them use serverless services to some fashion to build autonomous IT infrastructure for them. So this is to just give an idea of what a fully serverless application would look like, say for a mobile backend. So if you were to build a mobile application and you want to build a backend for it, So you would use some of the components that are shown in this particular architecture. So you can use an API gateway for a mobile app to connect. So the API gateway essentially allows you to create a REST-based interface for your mobile apps, and this provides you a fully managed infrastructure to run a REST API router. Now, from the REST API, you could easily call a Lambda function. Now, these functions can be written on, like I mentioned earlier, Python or Ruby or Node.js and so on. So the API gateway in turn invokes a Lambda function. The Lambda function can, write to, say, a DynamoDB data store to persist data. This in turn, when you persist data, let's say some of that data is something that you want to make searchable, let's say using say full text search. Now anything that goes into DynamoDB, you can easily build something called a DynamoDB stream that in turn invokes another Lambda function and pushes that record, the searchable record, into a search engine. So this could be Cloud Search, or it could even be Elasticsearch that you run on AWS. Now, when somebody wants to search that particular record, they can continue back to the API gateway. You invoke another Lambda function that connects back to the search engine that's running again in a serverless fashion. Similarly, if you want to implement some logic that sends back, say, mobile push notifications, you again invoke a Lambda function here that sends information back to what we call the SNS, or simple notification service. SNS can in turn send notifications back to mobile applications, mobile apps. It can even interact with email as well as text messages. So all of these are possible. All of this logic is possible with a purely serverless infrastructure on AWS. The other aspect that I missed out is content delivery that we spoke about earlier, right? Let's say you have a mobile app which also needs to show videos or stream videos, or load images that customers upload. You would customers may upload something through the API gateway, or they could directly upload into S3 from the mobile app, and this can in turn be streamed back to other customers through what we call a CloudFront content delivery network. The CloudFront CDN in turn will take advantage of the global infrastructure and the points of presence that we spoke about earlier, so that there is minimum latency for other end users. So that completes this compute part. Now we move on to storage. When you look at storage in AWS, there are customers typically need three types of storage: block, object, and file storage. Block storage is typically used for customers that want to host things like, say, their own databases, or infrastructure like compute servers or Kubernetes and things like that, where they need to access a file system which is block based. File storage is used for essentially serving files. So FSx for Windows File Server is something that's part of our Amazon EFS portfolio. So these are essentially file systems on which you can store files, and it can be accessed by either by applications or directly by customers over the internet. And this can be used as, say, home directories and so on and so forth. So third category is what we call object storage. So this is primarily used for storing files like very large files, like images and videos and audio files and so on and so forth, that need to be accessed easily by customers over the internet. So these are three categories, but we'll quickly touch upon S3, which is one of the most used service within AWS. Some of the applications that you would use S3 for would be website hosting, content file sharing. If you want to do data analytics, you would put your logs on S3, or any events that you're capturing from your applications, you can stream those to a S3 and store. S3 is one of the one of the most inexpensive forms of storage that's available. And you can, you can store terabytes of data for as low as $4 a month on S3. So, this is one of those services that gets used very frequently. Things like backup and restore is something that a lot of customers do. If you want to do mobile sync and backup, that's again something that S3 can be used for. So within S3 itself, S3, the full form for S3 is Simple Storage Service. And within S3 itself, what you need to understand is that we provide multiple classes of storage. So most customers would probably just pick up S3 and create a bunch of buckets. And these will be in what we call a standard tier. But what you can also look at is based on how often your objects will be accessed, you can potentially move the objects into other tiers, such as standard infrequent access, one zone access, and so on. So what happens is, let's say you have files that are not going to be accessed that often, you can move them to a lower tier of S3 and reduce the cost that you pay for S3 by orders of magnitude. So if you look at some of these numbers here, if you go to standard infrequent access from standard, it will be like 1/10 of what you pay here. And similarly, if you go from here to Glacier, it'll be even lesser, and so on and so forth. It's just that when you move to a lower tier, ideally the object that you save there is something that you don't need to access much often, because the time taken to access these objects will be much longer as compared to standard tier. So if you're hosting a website and if you want to serve, say, videos and music out of that website, you would typically use something called S3 standard. Now, let's say if you are storing logs, but that are purely for audit purpose, you would, something that you are using for less than a month, but every quarter, you would typically move that to something called infrequent access. Now, if you have, files that you need to save for, say, audit purpose, something that you need to show your auditors once in a year, you would potentially move that to something like S3 Glacier. So S3 has a way by which you can specify lifecycle policies for each of these objects so that these can be moved from one storage class to the other. The next category is, databases. Now we covered compute and storage. Databases is the other major category that a lot of customers use. Most customers start with a relational database, and either they'll be using MySQL or Postgres or something. A lot of startups typically prefer to use MySQL and Postgres because these are open systems and don't come with the licensing issues that usually come with Oracle and Microsoft SQL Server. But enterprises you use Oracle and SQL Server, so we support these as well. So Amazon RDS is a service that relational database service that allows you to spin up any of these engines within AWS. So you can see that there are multiple options within RDS that you can choose to run a relational database. But from a database standpoint, what Amazon believes is that relational is not the only answer. Each application has its own need of what type of data that they want to store, right? Not all data is relational or need to be relational. So if you have, let's say, something like a key value store that you want to build, you potentially will use Amazon DynamoDB or Amazon Document DB. Amazon Document DB is a MongoDB compatible document database that you can use on AWS. Similarly, a lot of customers use caching databases for caching their edge queries. Now we provide a service called Amazon Elastic Cache that allows you to spin up clusters of Memcached and Redis. So these are popular open source databases, key value stores that are out there that you can use on AWS as well. Many of our customers also use graph databases. Um, if you are building, let's say, a social network, or if you are building a recommendation engine, you may want to store your data in a graph form or a tree form. So Amazon Neptune is a database service that you can use to store a graph database. Similarly, we also provide very domain specific databases like Amazon Time Stream to store time series data. Some financial institutions also want to store data in ledger format. For this, we have something called Amazon QLDB, a quantum ledger database. So the recommendation that we have from Amazon is use databases that are purpose built so that you can use the features that are best suited for your application needs and the user's experience. Not all data need to be modeled as a SQL or a relational database. We can choose the right kind of database for your applications. So once you have built an application, and let's say you're running something that uses the compute, the storage, and the database, and so on. You would, as you progress through your application building life cycle, you need to figure out how you will make your releases available as fast as possible for your customers. So continuous integration and continuous development is a key practice that we recommend to most of the customers. So as you may already know, the last few years has seen a big change in terms of how release cycles are managed by startups and other enterprises using the DevOps philosophy. So CI/CD is a core to DevOps philosophy. Within DevOps itself, you will come across three broad terms, which is continuous integration, continuous delivery, and continuous deployment. Now, if you want to understand the difference between these, continuous integration essentially means as you build more features and add stuff to your source code, you build a process, you build an automatic process by which the source code is built and tested. And you also are made aware of any errors that come out of the tests. So this is called continuous integration. Continuous delivery takes it one step beyond. You automate the aspect of source commit, build and test, but also make sure that you have an ability to just click one button, and that whatever is tested, the output of the tests, the final package that can go into production can easily be deployed into production. Continuous deployment is taking continuous delivery itself one more step further, where you just check your code into a system like Git and GitHub, for example, and based on the branch in which you make a release, your build is automatically done, your tests are done, and even the deploy is done into production automatically. You don't need to worry about even deploying the code into the production infrastructure that you're hosting. So these are broadly the three ways in which release processes happen today. And we have a set of services that let you enable that process very easily. So we'll start from the left-hand side. Code Commit is a service that you can use in AWS, which is similar to GitHub. It basically enables you to run a hosted Git repository on AWS. So you can do things which you do very similar to GitHub. You can check into repositories, manage multiple branches, and so on and so forth. And it also enables triggers into what we call code build. Code build is essentially a way by which you can build and test the code that you check in. So a lot of startups use open source engines like Jenkins to manage their builds and test infrastructure. But in this case, when you are running Jenkins, you have to spin up a server and run it by your own. In the case of code build, you don't have to do that. It's all completely managed by by AWS, and all you need to understand is how to use code build to make sure that your code is built and tested. Similarly, code deploy is something that allows you to take the output of code build, which could be an application or a Docker package or a Docker image, and essentially deploy it into the infrastructure that you may be hosting. It could be EC2 or ECS or Lambda and so on and so forth. Code pipeline is a service that allows you to orchestrate events between code commit, code build, and code deploy. Some customers also, beyond this, they also want to make sure that they can provision the infrastructure also automatically. So there are services like Elastic Beanstalk that allows you to spin up a complete stack on AWS very fast. If you were to provision infrastructure on say EC2, we have something called OpsWorks. So this supports popular open source software like Chef and Puppet that you can use. You can use those recipes within those to provision infrastructure for your own. Similarly, CloudFormation is an internal AWS service that we allow you to provision or create infrastructure as code. CloudWatch is a service that allows you to, once you provision and deploy your infrastructure on production, you also need to be able to monitor and see what's happening with that application. So CloudWatch is a service that allows you to log your events, monitor, and create metrics that you can watch, and create alarms and notify yourself about what is happening within your infrastructure. So that that pretty much covers what how CI/CD is done on AWS and some of the services that we offer to do continuous integration, deployment, and delivery. Now we move on to something specific. This may not be applicable to everybody, but we have a very very broad and deep set of services that we provide as part of our machine learning stack. So if you look at our machine learning stack, a lot of startups today want to build applications or services that are enabled by machine learning or ML, and AI is core to what they build. So we have services that cater to three broad types of personas that will be using ML on AWS. So if you look at it, we have something called AI services, then there is something called ML services, and then there is something called ML frameworks and infrastructure. Now, if you already have a team of data scientists and ML experts, and you know how to pick up say TensorFlow, MXNet, or PyTorch, and spin up a server, you can use the ML frameworks and infrastructure that we offer. What you can do is you can pick up something we provide called deep learning AMIs that already have these packaged in those AMIs, and spin up servers and create and train and deploy your machine learning models here. The second category of services is what we call the SageMaker Studio IDE. This is essentially for customers who don't have a lot of deep ML expertise, but there are a few data scientists that know how to use Python and Jupyter notebooks, and they want to build ML models using AWS. So if you just have a few data scientists, you may want to explore the SageMaker IDE. What this does is it enables you to build a very exhaustive pipeline of ML. So you can start from things like tagging and classifying the data that you have. Use some of the built-in algorithms that we have to train your models. You can use notebooks to do the training, run experiments, and then you can debug the models that you create, and you can also host the models that you create. All of this is available within a very simple IDE that you can, spin up on AWS and use. The third category of services that you will see is what is called AI services. This is when you don't even have data scientists. All you have is a set of developers who are um, who know how to use APIs. So this is, you have categories of AI services within vision, speech, text, search, chatbots, personalization and recommendations, forecasting, fraud detection, and so on and so forth. So all the products that you see are basically available as APIs that you can very simply use. All you need to do is to be able to provide data to these services. These services pick up the data that you provide, and then based on the data, it creates an AI model that in turn that you can call using an API, and you can automatically enable some of your the applications with AI features like personalization and forecasting and so on. Uh, Quickly want to cover a couple of more. Mobile. If you want to build a mobile application, uh, we have a stack called AWS Amplify that you can use that enables you to build applications for iOS, Android, web, as well as React Native. You can use some of the popular frameworks that are available like Angular, Vue, or React, and so on, and use the Amplify framework to build a complete tool chain. And Amplify, what it does is it enables you to quickly access all the services that we spoke about so far and integrate that into the mobile application that you're building. I'll not go deep into these because I think we are running short of time. But some of the things that a lot of customers need when they build mobile apps is things like authentication, right? Sign in, sign on, login, password reset, multi-factor authentication, OTP based authentication, and so on and so forth. So Cognito is a service that you can use to do all of this. Similarly, a lot of customers want to either create REST APIs or GraphQL based APIs today. So the Amazon API Gateway is a service that allows you to create REST APIs. AppSync is a service that you can use to use GraphQL APIs. So if you are not aware of GraphQL, it's a modern application programming interface that Facebook has come up with, and it's fast becoming a standard. Similarly, if you want to do analytics, you may want to explore products or services like Pinpoint and Kinesis. Similarly, you can very easily use Amazon S3 for storage. If you want to build chatbots within mobile apps, you would look at Amazon Lex and so on. There are services that allow you to also do testing. For example, AWS Device Farm is a service that allows you to test mobile apps across multiple versions of operating systems. There is one of the challenging things when you build a mobile app, especially with Android, given the number of the OS versions and devices that are available. It's very difficult to actually test what works on each mobile app. So Device Farm is a service that you can very quickly use to make sure that your application works across multiple mobile devices. Last section, this is basically this covers the SDKs and tools that you can use. All of the services that I spoke about so far provides APIs to access these services, and all of the APIs are available as REST APIs. But if you don't want to actually use REST is not so easy to use. We also provide software development kits to directly access these services. So the SDKs are available in JavaScript, Python, PHP, .NET, Ruby, Java, Go, Node.js, and C++. We also integrate a lot of these SDKs with popular IDEs and kits. Cloud9 is an IDE that we provide completely online within the AWS console. But we also help you integrate some of these SDKs very easily with Eclipse, IntelliJ, VS Code, and so on and so forth. Beyond that, we also provide a set of command line interfaces The AWS CLI is one of the most used CLI that you would need to access the AWS services and deploy infrastructure on AWS. Similarly, you will notice there are CLIs for ECS, mobile, and so on and so forth. With that, I think I've come to the end of my talk. So I think if there is any questions from the audience, I think we can take care. Sorry, I think this took longer than I expected, but hopefully you all took something from this discussion.
So thank you so much. Actually, a lot of positive comments and good responses are coming in the chat window. We have quite a few questions, sir. Before that, I'll launch a poll with the participants in order to, which will allow them to rate the session. Participants, poll will be coming on the screen. You can choose that to rate the session. Yeah, you should be receiving the poll right now. Sir, would you want to take the questions right now, or should I email them to you?
If you think there is anything very generic that makes sense for the entire audience, I can take maybe a couple of questions, and you can maybe send the rest over later.
Okay, sir, sure. Most of the questions are very genuine, nothing in extreme particular. Few participants, however, directly messaged they wanted an email ID to directly send you the questions.
Okay, so I can then take the questions later. You can just send it over to me.
Few of them are generic questions also. Would you want me to post them right now?
Yeah, you can. You can ask a couple. I think we can. We have time for that.
Okay, sir. One of the participants is asking about how does the privacy of this whole AWS platform work, because it's completely on cloud. So they wanted to understand how does that work? How is it taken care of?
Yeah. So when you spin up, infrastructure on AWS, the data that you bring on is completely private to you. I mean, even we don't see what data you put on AWS. So um, you what all that AWS can see is uh, things below the operating systems to manage the infrastructure. And everything that you bring on to AWS is your own, right? AWS is secure by default. By that, what we mean is when you spin up a virtual private cloud, um, normally what happens is the rules are set that so that nothing is exposed to anybody outside the VPC that you spin up. But you do have the option of opening it up to specific users that you want to expose that particular service to. So what we call within VPC, we have features like security groups and NACLs that allow you to build a software defined firewall. So what happens there is you enable only certain ports that are accessible by outsiders, and only certain data can be accessed and so on and so forth. So this is completely within your control. But having said that, security of your data is a shared responsibility. So what I mean by that is if you add some data to AWS and you open it up completely to others, now that becomes your responsibility. But you have the option of completely encrypting and making the data completely private so that it does not, it's not available for anybody else.
Okay. Sir, another question is that how does the AWS for startup programs help startups? Can you take us through the process?
Yeah, so there are a whole set of programs that AWS runs. So actually, this will take quite a bit. I think this is something that Parth can probably
Sure.
cover in another session. But
Okay.
I will just cover, one program which is called Activate, AWS Activate. This is a program by which we enable credits for startups who want to use AWS as a platform. So there are credits that are available for using our infrastructure at multiple tiers. So it's even available for bootstrapped startups, with founders who have a company, who have a running company. Then there are credits that are available for startups who are part of, say, an accelerator or incubator. Or if you are already funded and if you're part of, let's say, an angel fund or a seed fund, or let's say a tier one VC, you will get access to more credits. So as you progress, as you build your business and as you build traction and as you raise funding, what we do is we enable startups to use our infrastructure based on credits that we offer. So this is something that you may want to look at. So if you go to aws.amazon.com/activate, you will get more information about this program.
Okay, so other questions are fairly, generic. Like one person asking, for digital marketing, is there any, use of adopting AWS for digital marketing agencies?
There is a product that we have called Amazon Pinpoint that allows you to easily create segments. So one of the things that a lot of customers need is the ability to segment their customers into multiple categories and send push notifications and text and emails and so on. So we provide a service called Pinpoint that can very easily integrate with the backend infrastructure as well as mobile applications that can be used by a lot of startups to target specific set of customers for actions.
Okay, sir. I think most of the questions have been answered, yeah, and the participants also answered the poll. So thank you so much again, sir. And most of the participants are looking out for the presentation. Sir, is it okay if we share them the video of this session? Would that?
Yeah, you can share the recording.
Okay. Okay. So a quick piece of information to participants. These session videos are being hosted on our YouTube channel. The further emails would also be containing the link to subscribe to the channel, wherein you can go and have a look of these sessions again. So once again, Satish, thank you so much. It was a very informative session, and we got extremely good feedback from the participants as well. We look forward to having you again.
Thank you so much. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure. Thank you so much. So participants, we'll be ending the session now. Thank you everybody for joining. I'm ending the webinar now. Thank you.